Out of every 4 stretcher bearers who went into no man's land during World War I, only 1 came back alive. They carried no weapons, wore no armor, and ventured into the most dangerous killing fields in human history, armed with nothing but a canvas stretcher and a Red Cross armband. They were described as the angels of the battlefield, and at the same time, the most vulnerable targets on the Western Front. But their story is far more horrific than it seems. And now you're going to see why. When people talk about the Great War, they usually mention the trenches, the gas attacks, or the machine guns. But the Western Front was a different kind of hell altogether. Stretching 440 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border, this maze of trenches, barbed wire, and shell holes became the deadliest workplace in human history. Between the opposing lines lay no man's land, a wasteland of mud, corpses, and unexploded shells that could be anywhere from 50 yards to half a mile wide. The British wanted to break through German lines and end the stalemate that had claimed millions of lives. But every assault meant thousands of wounded men scattered across this killing field, crying for help while machine guns swept the ground above them. The Germans, of course, knew this. They positioned their machine gun nests and artillery to cover every inch of no man's land, turning rescue attempts into suicide missions. Medical doctrine of the time stated that wounded soldiers had to be evacuated within the golden hour to have any chance of survival. But getting to them meant crossing terrain specifically designed to kill anyone who showed their head above ground level. That's where the stretcher bearers came in, 4 men per team, carrying a canvas stretcher that weighed 22 pounds empty, venturing into hell itself to save lives while everyone around them was trying to take them. To understand why being a stretcher bearer was such a nightmare, we need to take a look at how battlefield medicine actually worked. The standard British stretcher was 6 feet long, made of canvas stretched between 2 wooden poles, with leather handles and metal brackets for stability. It weighed 22 pounds without a patient, but with a wounded soldier, it could easily reach 200 pounds or more. 4 men were needed to carry it effectively. 2 at the front, 2 at the back, moving in perfect coordination across terrain that was anything but flat. The effective carrying range was only about 400 yards before the team needed rest. And that's under ideal conditions. In no man's land, with shells exploding around them and machine gun bullets whizzing overhead, that distance dropped dramatically. Your equipment was minimal. A steel helmet, a Red Cross armband that was supposed to protect you under the Geneva Convention, basic medical supplies, and that was it. No rifle, no pistol, no grenades. You were completely defenseless, relying entirely on international law and enemy mercy for protection. Here's the thing, though. International law meant nothing when both sides were using poison gas and targeting medical personnel became standard practice. The training was intense but could never prepare you for the reality. Stretcher bearers learned to move wounded soldiers without causing further injury, how to navigate shell holes and barbed wire obstacles, and how to provide basic first aid under fire. They practiced carrying techniques for different types of terrain and learned to work as a seamless unit where one person's mistake could kill the entire team, but the psychological preparation was impossible. How do you train someone to ignore the screams of wounded men while machine gun bullets are hitting the ground inches from your face? How do you prepare for the weight of choosing which wounded soldier gets saved first when you can only carry one at a time? These decisions haunted stretcher bearers for the rest of their lives, assuming they survived long enough to have a rest of their lives. The most dangerous part wasn't just the enemy fire, it was the time factor. Wounded soldiers in no man's land had minutes, sometimes seconds, before they bled out or went into shock. But reaching them required crossing hundreds of yards of open ground under direct observation by enemy snipers and machine gunners. The rescue team was completely exposed from the moment they left their trench until they returned with the wounded. On July 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, Private Thomas Collins found himself assigned to stretcher-bearer duty with the 16th Battalion Manchester Regiment. The British had been shelling German positions for 7 days straight, and everyone expected the wire to be cut and the enemy trenches destroyed. They were wrong on both counts. When the whistle blew at 7:30 a.m., 60,000 British soldiers went over the top. Within minutes, no man's land was carpeted with wounded and dying men. Collins and his team received their first call just 20 minutes into the attack. A sergeant with abdominal wounds was lying 300 yards out, bleeding to death in a shell crater. The 4-man team grabbed their stretcher and climbed out of the trench. The moment they appeared above ground level, German machine gunners opened fire. Collins could hear the bullets cracking past his ears as they ran in a crouch toward the wounded sergeant. The first man in his team, Private Williams, was hit in the leg after only 50 yards but kept moving. They reached the sergeant and loaded him onto the stretcher. That's when Collins realized just how exposed they really were. Carrying a wounded man meant moving slowly, staying upright, presenting a perfect target for every German soldier with a clear line of sight. The return journey took 12 agonizing minutes with bullets hitting the ground around them constantly. Williams collapsed from blood loss just as they reached their own trenches, but they had saved the sergeant. Collins would make 7 more trips into no man's land that day. Only 2 members of his original 4-man team survived until nightfall. He later wrote that the screams of wounded men haunting no man's land were worse than any nightmare he could imagine. But Collins wasn't the only one facing this horror. During the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917, stretcher-bearer teams were working in conditions that defied human endurance. The battlefield had turned into a swamp of mud, blood, and body parts where men could drown in shell holes filled with contaminated water. Corporal James Davies of the Royal Army Medical Corps was carrying wounded through this hellscape when his team became trapped in a German artillery barrage. Shells were landing every few seconds, throwing up geysers of mud and shrapnel that could cut a man in half. Davies and his team dove into a shell crater with their wounded patient, a young soldier with both legs shattered by machine gun fire. For 3 hours, they huddled in that crater, while the barrage continued overhead. The wounded soldier was going into shock from blood loss, but moving meant certain death. Davies used his own body to shield the patient from shell fragments, while trying to stop the bleeding with field dressings that were already soaked through. When the barrage finally lifted, Davies discovered that one of his team members had been killed by shrapnel, his body torn apart while trying to protect the wounded soldier. They completed the evacuation with only 3 men, carrying both the original patient and their dead teammate back to the aid station. Davies would continue serving as a stretcher bearer for 2 more years, witnessing horrors that would haunt him until his death in 1968. But if you think the previous story was incredible, consider what happened to Lance Corporal Frederick Thompson during the Third Battle of Ypres. Thompson was part of a stretcher-bearer team assigned to evacuate casualties from a forward observation post that had been overrun by German forces. The wounded were trapped in a concrete bunker, surrounded by enemy soldiers who had orders to take no prisoners. Thompson and his 3-man team volunteered for what everyone knew was a suicide mission. They would have to cross 400 yards of open ground, penetrate German lines, reach the bunker, and somehow extract wounded men while surrounded by the enemy. The odds of survival were essentially 0, but 12 British soldiers were bleeding to death in that bunker. They moved out at midnight, crawling through mud and wire for 2 hours to reach the German positions. Thompson could hear enemy soldiers talking just yards away as his team slipped past their sentries. When they reached the bunker, they found 8 wounded men still alive, including an officer with a severe head wound who was barely conscious. The evacuation took 4 trips. Each time, Thompson's team had to carry a wounded soldier back through German lines while avoiding patrols and sentries. On the 3rd trip, they were spotted by a German machine gun crew. The gunner opened fire, hitting one of Thompson's team members in the shoulder, but Thompson threw himself on top of the wounded soldier they were carrying and absorbed the rest of the burst. 3 bullets hit Thompson in the back and chest, puncturing his lung and shattering 2 ribs. But he refused to abandon the mission. With blood foaming from his mouth, he helped carry the remaining wounded soldiers to safety before collapsing from blood loss. Thompson survived his wounds and was awarded the Victoria Cross, but he never fully recovered from the lung damage and died from complications in 1923. These individual acts of heroism were happening across the entire Western Front, but the statistics tell the broader story of this deadly profession. Official British Army records show that stretcher bearers had a casualty rate of 75%, making it one of the most dangerous jobs in military history. For every 4 men who volunteered for this duty, 3 would become casualties themselves, either killed, wounded, or psychologically broken by what they witnessed. The effectiveness of stretcher-bearer teams was measured in lives saved, but the cost was staggering. During the Battle of the Somme alone, British stretcher-bearers evacuated over 150,000 wounded soldiers from no man's land. But the Medical Corps lost 8,000 men doing it, including 2,400 killed in action. These numbers don't include the psychological casualties, the men who survived physically but were destroyed mentally by the horrors they witnessed. The German army targeted medical personnel as a matter of policy, despite the Geneva Convention's protection of non-combatants. German snipers were specifically trained to identify and eliminate stretcher bearers, knowing that killing one medical team could result in multiple casualties as wounded soldiers bled to death waiting for rescue. Red Cross armbands became targets rather than protection. The long-term impact of this service extended far beyond the war itself. Stretcher bearers who survived often suffered from what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They had witnessed the worst of human suffering while being completely helpless to defend themselves or their patients. Many struggled with survivor's guilt, haunted by the men they couldn't save and the impossible choices they had to make under fire, but their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The techniques developed by stretcher-bearer teams during World War I became the foundation for modern battlefield medicine. Their work proved that rapid evacuation of casualties could dramatically improve survival rates, leading to the development of motorized ambulances, helicopter medevac, and the modern trauma care system that saves thousands of lives today. The courage of these unarmed men, walking into machine gun fire armed with nothing but compassion and determination, represents one of the finest examples of human heroism under the most impossible circumstances. They faced death every time they ventured into no man's land, not for glory or conquest, but simply to save lives. If you want to hear more stories like this about the forgotten heroes of warfare, help us out by subscribing. These men deserve to be remembered for their incredible sacrifice and the lives they saved in humanity's darkest hour.